Components are one of the key concepts when it comes to React. We'll be using functional components throughout this video. As of right now, with React 18 being the latest version, React themselves recommends using functional components versus class components. Independent and reusable bits of code. Speaking of code, let's dive right into it. So here we have a really simple app that I've created using Create React App. On the left, we have our code, and on the right, we have the output. The file I have open is called app.js. It contains this component called app. App is actually being rendered as the top level entry point component. I'll go over this more in another video that's coming up. Today, let's just focus on components. Inside of this app component, we have a few HTML tags. We have a header tag here, and then we have a div here that has some content inside for our web page, which you can see right over here. So what makes up a functional component? It must return a JSX block. I covered all the ins and outs of JSX in my last video, which should be linked right up here. And the component's name must be capitalized. The props can be taken as the function's argument. But we're going to go over props in the next video coming up. So let's add a component. You can see we have app, which is a function, which returns a JSX block. Let's make the same thing right above. We'll say example component. And I'm just going to make a error function, and I'll have it just return some JSX. We'll do something simple, and we'll just return a div, and inside of that div, we'll just write example component. Now I'll show you how to render this component within our app component itself. I'll put it right after this paragraph. It's exactly like writing an HTML tag. However, it's always capitalized. If it's not capitalized, it will not render correctly. So let's add an opening tag, and then we'll write example component and a closing tag. And I spelled component wrong. So now that I fixed that little typo, you can see over here, example component is now on our web page. A rule of thumb in React is to try and make our components as small as possible. One reason being, it's good to reuse components so that you don't have to rewrite code twice. And another reason being that we don't want our components to get so overwhelming and messy that they're difficult for another dev that comes into your project to understand. So let's actually pick apart this app component and take these two sections and put them into their own components. So first we'll just call this heading. I'm just going to copy and paste this H1, and that's all I'll be returning there. And then I can get rid of this H1 and just write heading in the closing tag. And you can see on the right side, we're still outputting the same result. And now I can take this whole block here and put that into its own component as well. We'll call that component content. And now I'm just going to copy this and return. And then here I can get rid of all that and write content. And you can see on the right, the same exact thing is being output. Of course, for this component that's really small called app, it wasn't critical to break out these two components. However, when you're in some sort of production style app, it is critical because this app will quickly expand and expand. And you want to try and break down the pieces of your app as much as you possibly can for code clarity and reusability of components. Since we've broken these into their own components, I actually can render it as many times as I want. So say I wanted to have two headings for some silly reason, you can now see there's two headings. I could have put tons of headings, however many I wanted, same with content, which is really helpful for things like a list or different things like, say you wanted to render a bunch of buttons on a page, but they all were a little bit different. You created a component called button and then have multiple components that look the same, that have slightly different attributes, which we'll go more into in the next tutorial when we're talking all about props. So stay tuned for that. Components can actually be conditionally rendered. So here we're just returning a div, an H1, a content div with stuff inside of it. However, sometimes you have logic that comes into it that says, if this thing, return this block, otherwise return this block. We'll do this in the heading. We'll just set a constant because this is just to practice, and our constant will be render cool heading. And I'll set that to true. So here I'm going to write an if statement that says if render cool heading, and then I'm going to return cool heading. And then you can see that changes to cool heading. Since I set it to a constant, this is always going to return this cool heading. But later on, when you have actual data coming into your app, this is really critical. Lastly, let's talk about exporting and importing components. So right now I have all these components in the same file, which typically is a bad practice. Generally, you want to make a file per component. That readability is very important. It's important to keep everything organized, structured, so that other devs that you're working with can understand your code right when they come to it. And not only other devs, but you, when you come to your code tomorrow. You might forget by then. All right, so before I'm going to do import-export statements, I'm just going to put this back to where it was. Just our heading and our content. Okay, so we're going to come over here to this components folder that I've created within this Create React app, and we're going to create a new file. That file is going to be called examplecomponent.jsx, which symbolizes that it's a JSX file. Create that, add it, come back over to our app.js, copy example component, paste it here. And now we have this example component that lives in this file only. So no other files will be able to access this unless we export and import this component. So what I'm going to do down below is write export default example component. Once again, I spelled component wrong. I don't know why I keep doing that. Crushing it. So if I go back to app.js, I can get rid of this example component and write an import statement that says import example component from, access our components folder, and then the example component. You'll see that it's being rendered correctly. Just to show you a little bit more, example component in the file, I'll just write that just so you can see. And you can see over here that it's actually rendering this example component within this file. And we can do this for all other components as well. We could just put these into a heading component. I'll add a content component. I'll come over here and do the same thing. I'll copy and paste and write export default heading. And I'll just do the same thing with content. Copy this, paste this. Since we previously imported our example component into the app, we're actually going to be able to just get rid of this import. So now that I'm over here in content, you can see that since I copy and pasted this, my IDE was smart enough to know where example component lived, which is now within this components folder. So if I put export default content on the bottom, and I come over to app.js, and actually get rid of all of this, and I'll write import heading from component slash heading, and import content component slash content. Everything reload, and you can see everything is still rendering the exact same way. And you also can see that this is so much cleaner than what we had a couple seconds ago. You know that your heading component lives here, it's in a small block, your content is in a small block over here, and content is also consuming the smaller example component. It's so important to break these up into smaller files because readability is critical. Thank you so much for watching, and there's tons more to come in this React tutorial, so stay tuned for more.